Donald Trump sat directly across the table from Barack Obama and methodically presented him with three specific identities, three distinct individuals from his presidential campaign whose lives had been completely shattered by a federal inquiry. It was an investigation that Obama's FBI had initiated by utilizing data and intelligence that the Bureau's own leadership knew to be entirely fabricated. Immediately after that, he produced a single confidential document originating from deep inside the West Wing, an official record that had never been intended to exit the confines of the building. For the very first time in his public life, Obama found himself utterly unable to transform three simple human names into an expansive, poetic oration regarding the grand, sweeping arc of human history. I would like to state a few words regarding the integrity of our legal system and the rule of law. Barack Obama began. He sat perfectly composed, his suit jacket completely buttoned up and his hands resting flatly upon the dark wood surface, positioned at perfectly equal distances from the microphone standing before him. His voice, the exact same resonant cadence that had once reverberated through the crowds at Grant Park on his historic election night, that had offered profound solace to grieving families when he eulogized young children in Newtown, and that had filled a Charleston sanctuary with the melody of Amazing Grace, carried that very particular, unmistakable depth it always took on whenever he intended to make an entire auditorium remember exactly what it owed to democratic institutions. However, there was an undeniably sharper, more rigid element underlying his delivery today. A cold hardness existed just beneath his rhythmic speech, precisely the way solid structural rebar lives hidden beneath smooth, polished marble. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not function as a partisan political instrument, Obama asserted firmly. Under no chief executive in our history has it ever been converted into a weapon directed at internal political competitors. The mere insinuation that such activity occurred under my presidential administration is not only fundamentally incorrect, it is actively perilous. It is dangerous precisely because it erodes the very institutional foundations that safeguard our democracy from the exact brand of misconduct it is currently being accused of. He paused deliberately. The entire hearing room leaned forward simultaneously, matching the exact way crowded rooms always lean whenever Obama pauses, shifting forward involuntarily by half an inch. I actively welcome this dialogue, Obama continued, his gaze steady. I have absolutely nothing to conceal. He had just asserted to the room that he had nothing to hide. Yet, the chief executive, sitting right across from him, held a manila folder containing three specific names, three real people, whose entire existences his administration had effectively demolished alongside a single Oval Office. Document that directly proved otherwise. Donald Trump sat opposite him with his necktie hanging roughly a half-inch too long, his suit jacket completely unbuttoned, and a single file folder resting untouched on the table in front of him since the moment he first took his seat. He stared at Obama the way he typically evaluated most people directly, intensely, without offering the superficial courtesy of pretending his unblinking stare was about anything other than cold measurement. Thank you, Mr. President, Trump finally remarked, letting a brief beat of silence pass. Or perhaps I should say former president. I always seem to get a bit confused regarding the two of us. A sudden ripple moved through the spectator gallery, not quite a burst of laughter, but something much lighter, the rapid collective exhale of onlookers who had been waiting anxiously for Trump to finally act like Trump. And there it was, right on cue. Obama did not offer even a trace of a smile. His face maintained the rigid expression of a man who has heard the exact same joke multiple times before and has resolved once again not to dignify it with a reaction. They instructed me to maintain a very serious demeanor today, Trump observed to the room. Extremely serious. They told me, sir, this constitutes a monumental, highly important hearing. And I replied to them, I am fully aware of its significance. It represents the single grandest political scandal in the entire history of our nation. Quite frankly, perhaps the largest scandal in the history of any country globally. And believe me, I recognize a massive event when I see one. He dismissed that thought entirely, waving it away with a swift motion of his hand, the way a man carelessly brushes aside a cloud of smoke. But I am not going to do what I typically do today, Trump stated. I am not going to invent a clever nickname for this. I am not going to launch into a series of social media posts about it. Instead, I am going to do something that I almost never do. He locked eyes directly with Obama. His unyielding gaze stopped merely measuring and started actively aiming. I am going to read, Trump announced simply. He opened the manila folder. The entire room immediately adjusted its posture. A female reporter shifted forward in her seat, and a nearby security marshal uncrossed his arms because the sight of Donald Trump methodically reading text from a physical file folder was something none of them had ever witnessed before. The absolute unfamiliarity of the action carried an inherent weight that his typical spontaneous performances never managed to command. Because this matter is not about me, Mr. President, Trump declared, everyone out there assumes it revolves around me. The mainstream media insists it is about me. Even my own staffers and people believe it concerns me, but they are all entirely wrong. He pulled 3 distinct pieces of paper from inside the folder and placed them face down on the table. This is about 3 ordinary people you have probably never once spent time thinking about, Trump stated. 3 individuals whose names you have definitely never uttered out loud. They were contributors on my campaign. Normal, everyday citizens. Not famous personalities. Not wealthy elites. They signed up because they genuinely believed in a cause, and your FBI completely destroyed their worlds. He turned over the very first page. Carter Page. Trump read aloud, pronouncing the name with the flat, solemn cadence one uses when reading a name off a black memorial wall, flat, meticulous, ensuring every single syllable arrived clearly. A graduate of the United States Naval Academy who spent time stationed in Moscow as a young officer serving the Navy. In 2013, 3 full years before I ever decided to run for any political office, Carter Page actively assisted the FBI in building a criminal case against actual Russian espionage operatives working on American soil. The Department of Justice extended public gratitude to him. They officially designated him as UC1 in the criminal indictment, undercover employee number 1. He literally helped them apprehend Russian spies, and your FBI presented him with an official commendation. Trump set that initial page down and reached for the second document, which was printed on heavier paper with a official government seal stamped at the top. 3 years later, your FBI targeted that exact same individual, the very man they had formally thanked for catching real Russian spies, and slapped a FISA surveillance warrant on him. Trump, continuous, they told a highly confidential intelligence court that Carter Page was functioning as a foreign agent for Russia. They anchored that intrusive warrant entirely on a dossier, the Steele dossier, that was funded directly by the Clinton presidential campaign and compiled by a foreign national. Furthermore, it was based on an informant who later explicitly told the FBI that the information was entirely unreliable bar talk and rumor. He placed the second document right next to the first one. Your own Inspector General ultimately uncovered 17 separate significant errors and omissions within those surveillance applications. 17, your own line, FBI attorney Kevin Kleinsmith officially pleaded guilty to actively altering evidence within the application process. A federal court eventually threw out 2 of those 4 approved warrants entirely. He raised his head to look across the table. Carter Page assisted the Bureau in catching Russian spies, and the Bureau thanked him for it. And then they weaponized a fraudulent dossier to secure a warrant to spy on him simply because he volunteered for my campaign. Trump paused. This particular silence was not an Obama-style pause. It was not calculated, nor was it musical. It was the heavy silence of a man who is genuinely furious and is deliberately selecting his next words rather than shouting out the very first ones that pop into his mind. That is it, Trump said. That represents the entire crime. He joined my campaign. He turned over the second sheet of paper. Michael Flynn, Trump read, Lieutenant General, United States Army, 33 years of continuous military service, 3 separate combat deployments, and director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was your director, Mr. President. You were the one who personally appointed him to that position. He read off the facts smoothly, matching the tone of a man listing an itemized bill of damages. FBI agents went to interview Flynn inside the White House. The 2 specific agents who conducted that interview documented in their notes that they believed he was being entirely truthful. Yet the FBI leadership hierarchy in Washington deliberately chose to overrule that direct field assessment. Flynn faced criminal charges. He exhausted $5 million in mounting legal fees. He lost his family home. His relatives received terrifying death threats. His own son was threatened with federal prosecution as a compliance lever. For 33 years, he dedicated his life to serving this country, and they stripped him of his home simply because he had a phone conversation with a Russian ambassador, an action that was his explicit job description, not a federal offense. An incoming national security advisor conversing with foreign ambassadors is precisely what the role demands. An older gentleman sitting in the spectator gallery, wearing a military lapel pin that caught the light each time he took a breath, crossed his arms tightly over his chest and remained completely frozen. Trump turned over the third sheet of paper. George Papadopoulos, he read aloud, 28 years old, a junior campaign advisor who was barely visible on our organizational chart. He held the paper at a slight angle, as though he were reading a letter from an unfamiliar sender. A foreign intelligence asset, a professor named Mifsud, who maintained connections to Western intelligence services, approached Papadopoulos and informed him that the Russians possessed damaging material on Clinton. Papadopoulos later casually repeated this remark at a bar to an Australian diplomat. That diplomat subsequently reported the chat to the FBI, and the Bureau utilized that specific conversation, a dialogue initiated by their own intelligence asset, as the fundamental basis for opening Crossfire Hurricane, the sweeping investigation into my entire campaign apparatus. George Papadopoulos went to prison for 14 days. A 28-year-old kid who was simply excited to contribute to a campaign, who got completely manipulated by an operative your government placed right in front of him, and who ended up serving jail time because of it. Trump arranged the 3 white pages side by side on the table. 3 pages, 3 distinct names, not an extensive historical record like a Kennedy timeline or a Johnson calendar, but just 3 plain white rectangles, each bearing a name at the top, and each carrying the immense weight of a human life that had been picked up and dropped from a devastating height. These do not constitute mere files, Mr. President, Trump stated. His voice was still the exact same voice the room knew well, the familiar Trump voice, the rally voice, the booming voice that filled sports arenas. Yet there was a specific quality in it now that the arena voice never carried, something resting quietly in the lower register where the theatrical performance ends and the actual human being begins. These are real people, actual human beings with families, home mortgages, and young kids who search their father's name online only to find the word traitor plastered on the very first page of results. Your FBI engineered this. Obama leaned forward slightly. The solid posture of his frame shifted visibly from presidential to academic, moving away from testimony and into a lecture. His voice found that familiar register he always employed whenever he was about to explain a complex topic to someone who failed to grasp the larger picture. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not operate or conduct investigations at the personal direction of the president, Obama explained smoothly. It never has. The Crossfire Hurricane investigation was opened exclusively by career law enforcement professionals, not by political appointees, based entirely on credible data received from a trusted foreign intelligence ally. I did not direct that inquiry, nor did I ever interfere with its execution. Furthermore, the Inspector General, your own Inspector General, Mr. President, who was formally appointed by your own administration, uncovered no verifiable evidence that political bias or improper motives ever influenced the initial decision to open this investigation. His voice steadied firmly on the final word, evidence. He repeated it for emphasis. Evidence. Not mere suspicion, not unsubstantiated allegation, actual evidence. And there was absolutely none found. Trump permitted the sentence to conclude. He let it sit quietly in the room for a second or two, matching the way a driver lets a car idle before putting it into gear. The Inspector General also uncovered 17 significant errors and omissions within those surveillance applications Trump countered. 17. Not one single mistake, not 3 mistakes, but 17. And your line, FBI attorney, pleaded guilty to actively falsifying evidence in order to secure one of those warrants. He tilted his head slightly. You choose to call that independent. I choose to call it incredibly sloppy. At best, a reporter sitting in the second row of the press section scribbled something down rapidly on her pad and drew a circle around it. Let me read you a few text messages, Trump continued, pulling a fresh page from his folder, a printout featuring sequential timestamps running down the left margin. These are messages exchanged between Peter Strzok, the lead investigating agent on Crossfire Hurricane, your hand-picked investigator, the man you trusted to manage the most sensitive counterintelligence inquiry in the entire history of the Bureau and Lisa Page, an FBI attorney with whom he was carrying on an extramarital affair. Not that the romance matters, the text messages themselves matter immensely. He read the first text aloud. The 8th of August, 2016, Strzok texts Page, Trump's not ever going to become president, right? Right? Page responds, no, he's not. We'll stop it. A woman sitting in the gallery inhaled sharply through her nose a single brief intake of air that carried the distinct sound of a person confronting something they already knew to be true but had never actually heard read aloud in an official room with a gavel. We'll stop it. That represents your lead investigator, Mr. President, the man actively running the operation into my campaign, texting his girlfriend that he will personally prevent me from winning the presidency. And he remained in charge of the investigation while doing so. He moved to the second text message, the 5th of August, 2016. Page texts, Strzok, the White House is running this. He proceeded to read the third text from the 2nd of September 2016, slowing down his pace to emphasize every individual word. Page texts, Strzok, POTUS wants to know everything we're doing. He set the sheet of paper back down. POTUS, Trump remarked, looking directly at Obama, that signifies you, not the FBI director and not the Attorney General. You, your very own agent, explicitly wrote in a text message to another agent that you, the President of the United States, demanded to know everything they were doing. And what they were actively doing, Mr. President, was spying on my campaign. You just stated that you didn't direct it. You just asserted that the Bureau is entirely independent. He tapped his finger against the page. Your agent says POTUS wants to know everything. That does not describe independence. That describes a leash. Now, I am going to read you something that has never once been read in public before, Trump announced. He reached deep into the folder and pulled out a single final page that looked visibly different from the others printed on heavier document stock with a clear classification stamp at the top that the news cameras in the back row immediately zoomed in on before he even uttered a word. The 5th of January 2017, the Oval Office. You were present there. Vice President Biden was present. FBI Director Comey was present. Deputy Attorney General Yates and National Security Advisor Rice were present. We are fully aware that this meeting occurred because Susan Rice wrote a detailed email to herself about it on Inauguration Day, the exact day I formally took office, documenting that you explicitly stated everything should be done strictly by the book. He began reading from the page. The voice that had filled massive sports arenas, dominated chaotic rallies, and shouted over spinning helicopter rotors on the South Lawn went completely quiet. It became library quiet, deposition quiet, and the entire room, which had been fully calibrated to hear Trump at maximum volume, had to rapidly adjust to hear Trump at a whisper, and that sudden recalibration in itself served as a powerful kind of alarm. This is a classified briefing note recorded from that exact meeting, Trump read. It states, POTUS was briefed that FISA surveillance on subject Carter Page has collected communications involving members of the Trump transition team. POTUS directed that all collected material be preserved and shared under existing classification protocols. POTUS emphasized that this should be done by the book. He set the page down, by the book. That is exactly what you instructed. Susan Rice put those exact words in writing on the very last day of your presidency. And here it is surfacing again in a confidential briefing note from directly inside the Oval Office. He looked straight at Obama. But the standard book does not include spying on a rival political campaign using a completely fabricated dossier. The book does not include 17 significant errors in a judicial warrant application. The book does not include an FBI lawyer who actively falsifies evidence. The book does not include "We'll stop it." Your book was completely fake, Mr. President, and you read from it anyway. He turned his head toward the spectator gallery slowly, as if he had just remembered a final detail. I would like to do one more thing, provided the chairman will permit it, Trump requested. He looked directly into the third row of the gallery, not at the members of the press and not at the political staffers, but at a man sitting completely alone in a suit with his hands quietly folded on his lap. Carter, please stand up. The man rose to his feet. He was of medium height, with graying hair at his temples. He wore a dark, conventional suit with no tie, and his face carried that very specific hollow blankness characteristic of a person who has been described extensively on national television by analysts who have never actually met him. He had been described as a spy, a traitor, and a hostile foreign asset in news, chyrons, headlines, and political panel discussions that ran continuously for 3 years while he sat completely alone inside an apartment watching total strangers dismantle his entire reputation on screens he could not bring himself to turn off. He stood there with his hands resting at his sides, completely silent, and as the entire room turned to look at him, what they saw was not a spy. What they saw was simply a man in a suit who looked exhausted in a profound way that had absolutely nothing to do with a lack of sleep. 30 feet, that was the exact physical distance separating Carter Page from Barack Obama. 30 feet comprised of a hearing room, table, a microphone, carpet, a gallery railing, and a vast distance that was not measured in feet at all, but in years. 8 long years, 8 years since the initial warrant was stamped. 8 years since the word traitor first appeared printed next to his name. 8 years of absolute silence from the administration that had placed him there in the first place. That is him, Trump said, looking directly at Obama, not at Page, at Obama. That is the actual man your FBI spied on, a graduate of the Naval Academy, a man who actively helped the Bureau catch real Russian spies, real ones, not made-up ones. And you approved a warrant on him based entirely on a dossier that your own agent's source explicitly told the FBI was unreliable bar talk. And you allowed that intrusive warrant to sit on him for a full year while every single news network in this country branded him a traitor. Obama's eyes moved. They shifted down to the table, focusing on the page bearing Carter Page's name, They did not drift toward the gallery. They did not look at the man standing right there in the room. And that deliberate decision not to look the highly visible, active choice to look at the paper instead of looking at the actual person was the loudest thing Obama had done all morning. Trump stared at Page for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, utilizing a voice that did not belong in a sports arena, on a political stage, or in front of a television camera, a voice meant for a room with just two people and a closed door. Sit down, Carter. You've stood long enough. Page sat back down. The seat folded underneath him with a small mechanical sound, and that single sound traveled through the absolute quiet of the room the way a stone drops through perfectly still water, a solitary disturbance that the surface immediately closes over, but never truly forgets. Carter Page, the very man the FBI had labeled a Russian spy, had just stood up in the gallery and looked Barack Obama right in the eye. He had helped the FBI catch actual Russian spies, and they spied on him anyway. Trump did not stand up to deliver his closing remarks. He remained seated in his chair. He placed both of his hands perfectly flat on the table, palms down, fingers completely still. And when he spoke, his voice dropped into a register that absolutely nobody in the room had ever heard from him before. Not the press corps, not the political staff, and not the spectator gallery that had spent the opening 10 minutes chuckling at his jokes. The showman persona was completely gone. The nicknames were gone. The grand proclamations of the biggest scandal were gone. What remained was simply a man sitting at a table talking directly to another man without an audience in mind. Mr. President, I am going to drop the act for a moment, Trump said. The networks won't like it. The television ratings are probably going to go down. But I want to say something directly to you, man to man, without the show. His hands did not shift. His body did not move. He was, for the first time all morning, completely motionless. And the utter stillness of Donald Trump was the strangest sight in the entire room, because Donald Trump was fundamentally not designed for stillness. He was built for motion, for volume, for the constant kinetic energy of a man who has never once in his life sat quietly with his hands resting flat on a table and meant every single word he was about to say. And yet, here he was. You spied directly on my campaign, Trump stated flatly. Your FBI utilized a dossier that your FBI knew was entirely fake to secure a surveillance warrant on a man who had actively helped your FBI catch real Russian spies. Your lead investigator texted his girlfriend promising that he would stop me from becoming president. Your FBI attorney explicitly falsified evidence within a warrant application. And when it was all finally over, when Mueller found absolutely nothing, when the IG uncovered 17 significant errors, when 2 of the 4 warrants were thrown out by a federal court, nobody offered an apology. Nobody picked up the phone to call Carter Page and tell him they were sorry. Nobody called Michael Flynn to return his $5 million and his home. Nobody called George Papadopoulos and gave him back his lost years. His voice dropped down one more notch. I am a loud person, Mr. President. I know that. The entire world knows that. But this matter is not a loud thing. He spoke softly. This is a quiet thing. This involves 3 distinct people whose lives you broke. 3 people who have never once heard their names spoken by the man whose administration broke them. He stared directly at Obama, Carter Page, Michael Flynn, George Papadopoulos, he said, pronouncing each name separately, leaving a deliberate space between them the way a person lays stones down on a grave. Say their names. The fluorescent overhead lights hummed quietly. The room's air conditioning breathed softly. Nobody inside the room moved a muscle. You can't do it, Trump observed, because the exact moment you say their names out loud, you permanently own what happened to them. And you have spent 8 full years making absolutely sure you never have to own it. The committee chairman formally asked President Obama whether he wished to offer a response. Obama opened his mouth to speak. The The men you've named, I didn't ask you to talk about them, Trump interrupted, his voice remaining quiet, still resting in that unfamiliar register nobody had heard before. I asked you to say their names. Obama's right hand went up to his necktie. The adjustment he made was tiny, a mere quarter turn of the knot, barely visible, but it marked the second time he had touched it. And a man who has been on camera for as long as Obama has been on camera does not adjust his tie twice in the exact same hearing, unless his hands are actively looking for work that his mouth cannot provide. His left hand shifted from the table down to his knee, completely beneath the camera line, and whatever it did there, it did entirely alone. The individuals involved in the Crossfire Hurricane matter have been the subject of extensive, thorough review by multiple independent names, Trump said, cutting in. He said it the way an experienced teacher pronounces a word that a student has been actively avoiding for an entire semester, not angry, but patient, which was far worse. Not individuals involved, not the matter, and not extensive review. Carter Page. 2 words, 2 syllables each. Say it. Obama did not say it. He sat with the request the exact way a man sits, with a heavy financial bill he cannot pay, looking directly at it, understanding exactly what it asks of him, but completely unable to meet it. His posture remained absolutely perfect. His face held the exact same expression it had maintained through 8 years of cameras, 2 intense presidential campaigns, and 1,000 rooms where his voice had been the most powerful instrument in the entire building. It was an expression of calm, deeply considered authority, the look of a man who always possesses a next sentence. But the next sentence was simply not coming. The instrument was right there, the voice, the rhythm, the cadence, the pauses, all of it, but the musician was sitting right behind it with his hands completely off the keys. And the entire room, which had spent the morning leaning into Obama's silences because his silences always preceded his very best sentences, was leaning forward now and finding absolutely nothing. The lean went forward and met entirely empty air, I believe. He finally stated, and the pause that followed those 2 words was the single longest pause of his public life. It was not because he chose it the way he usually chose his pauses, deploying them like calculated rests in a piece of music, but because the shelf he was reaching for was completely empty, and his hand was closing on thin air, that these matters have been thoroughly reviewed. 9 words. 9 words from the man who had once given the world the audacity of hope, a more perfect union, and the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. 9 words that contained no arc, no hope, no justice, and no music. They were 9 words assembled from the spare parts of bureaucratic language by a man whose real words, the words that had made an entire country believe in him, that had filled packed stadiums and moved millions, had, for the first time in his life, refused to come when called. Trump said nothing more. The 3 white pages sat quietly on the table between them, white paper against dark wood, and the physical distance between the 2 men was precisely 12 feet, but the distance between saying a name and refusing to say it was something else entirely, and both of them knew exactly which distance was larger. The video clip broke the internet, garnering 80 million views in 72 hours, becoming the single largest broadcast in the series because it featured Trump and Obama. It exploded because it was deeply personal, and because the short 60-second version contained a specific moment that no one who witnessed it would ever forget. Trump saying, "Say their names," and Obama sitting there, utterly unable to say them. The full, long-form, 19-minute version running from "I am going to do something I almost never do" all the way through. You've stood long enough to the final, heavy silence circulated in an entirely different way. It was the kind of video clip people watched completely alone late at night with the door closed, because the core question it posed was not political at all. It was deeply personal, If you possess the absolute power to destroy 3 innocent people's lives and get away with it completely, would you ever be strong enough to say their names? In the days that followed, the Department of Justice announced a formal review into the 5th of January 2017 Oval Office meeting and officially issued subpoenas for all related briefing materials. The House Intelligence Committee demanded the complete declassification of all Crossfire hurricane records. Carter Page filed a major civil suit against the FBI, and Michael Flynn filed a civil suit against the Department of Justice. 3 sitting Democratic senators released public statements calling for total transparency, which, in the language of Washington, is the specific word that comes right before investigation, which is the word that comes right before accountability. And everyone understood the sequence perfectly. That evening, Carter Page walked out of the Capitol building, stood on the massive stone steps, and looked down at Washington. This was the city that had branded him a Russian spy on every cable news network for 3 straight years, that had printed his name right next to the word traitor in newspapers he used to read with his morning coffee, and that had taken a Naval Academy graduate who helped catch actual Russian spies and turned him into a national punchline and an outcast. He stood there in his dark suit with his hands resting in his pockets, and a reporter shouted out, "Mr. Page, how does it feel?" And he chose not to answer, because the true answer was not a sentence. The answer was the simple fact that he was standing on the steps of the Capitol in the warm, late afternoon sun, and his name had finally been spoken out loud in a room where the man who authorized the warrant was sitting a mere 12 feet away. And that was something that had not happened once in 8 long years. And for now, that was enough. It was entirely enough. Inside the presidential limousine on the quiet drive back to the White House, Donald Trump sat in the back seat and did not utter a single word. He did not pick up his smartphone. He did not call anyone. He did not tweet. He simply looked out the window at the city sliding past at the monuments, the marble, and the grand government buildings where decisions are made that alter human lives, sometimes for the better and sometimes not. He sat quietly with what he had done, and he did not feel the need to perform it for anyone. The driver, who had driven him for 5 continuous years and had heard him make countless phone calls, dictate furious tweets, argue with advisors, and bark orders through every single drive between buildings in the Capitol, glanced up into the rearview mirror and saw something he had never seen before. He saw the president sitting completely still, no phone in hand, no voice, just a man looking out a window at a city he had accused of crimes, holding the heavy silence the way a person holds something they are not entirely sure they want to set down. Meanwhile, tucked away within the quiet sanctuary of his expansive estate on Martha's Vineyard, Barack Obama sat motionless in his private study. The room was the epitome of refined intellectual comfort, enveloped by towering bookshelves that stretched seamlessly from the floor to the high ceiling. In the center of the space sat a heavy desk meticulously crafted from rich, reclaimed timber, illuminated by a sleek designer reading lamp whose price tag easily eclipsed most ordinary citizens' monthly automobile payments. Resting squarely on the wooden surface directly in front of the former president was a standard yellow legal pad. The top sheet of the pad remained completely, starkly blank. His mind, however, was intensely occupied. He was thinking deeply about 3 specific names that had come to define the morning's confrontation: Carter Page, Michael Flynn, and George Papadopoulos. He knew these names perfectly. The undeniable reality was that he had always known them. Over the years, he had read them printed clearly in the highly classified pages of his daily intelligence briefings. He had heard them analyzed in hushed tones during high-level national security meetings in the Situation Room, and he had seen them splashed across the sensational headlines of every major media outlet in the country. Yet, in 8 long years, he had never once uttered those names out loud in a room where someone possessed the authority to look him in the eye and ask him exactly what his administration had done to the actual human beings those names belonged to. The three names seemed to hover invisibly over the unblemished yellow paper. He did not pick up his pen to commit them to ink, because he understood that writing them down meant actively owning them, and accepting ownership for the destruction of their lives was the one thing the greatest, most celebrated orator of his generation simply could not bring himself to do with words. And so the page stayed entirely blank. The names remained tightly locked inside the quiet, insulated confines of his own head. The immense protective distance between those 2 points, the vast chasm that separates internal knowing from external saying, that divides intellectual understanding from moral admission, was the exact same psychological armor that had always shielded his historic legacy. Except now, that armor was beginning to fail. He could distinctly feel that distance shrinking, collapsing around him in the quiet room. For the very first time in his public life, the man who had moved millions with his eloquence discovered that he did not have a speech for that. He had no rhythmic cadence, no elegant phrase, and no soaring rhetoric to bridge the gap. The narrative ultimately collapsed under the weight of those three identities, three ordinary people whose entire existences had been thoroughly dismantled by a federal investigation, anchored on evidence the FBI knew from the very beginning to be entirely fabricated. Carter Page, Michael Flynn, George Papadopoulos. When confronted with the human cost of his administration's actions, he was asked simply to say their names aloud. He couldn't.